This is the video lecture for Chapter 4, Part 2. In Part 1, we'd started talking about the sources of socialization, where socialization is a process by which a person learns those things necessary to be able to interact with other people successfully. We talked about a number of outside influences, probably in terms of the degree of impact. So family was first, then schools came second, then peers came third. So working a way down in terms of those other influences that help to socialize an individual, look at the influence of media. There's a great deal of questioning about the degree to which the media can influence individuals. Perhaps you had heard of a case 15 or 20 years ago where somebody ends up committing suicide, and the argument was being brought by the deceased child's parents was that by playing a particular band's record backwards, you could hear commands to commit suicide. Ultimately, the lawsuit failed, even though the music was played backward for purposes of the jury. They did not hear conclusively the kinds of commands to commit suicide. And of course, there are larger issues that even if you did have such a thing, what is it? How could the parents show successfully that and only the information from the music was what caused the child to commit suicide? Perhaps this is the reason why people end up looking at lawyers so disparagingly to imagine that this was actually a credible theory for a lawsuit. There have been other studies or other questions about the degree to which video games cause people to be violent, or pornography ends up desensitizing children so that they would end up becoming socialized in a particular way. Part of the difficulty in being able to establish that media contributes to the socialization of a child is to be able to eliminate outside factors, and then also to be able to figure out the mechanism by which somebody takes video messages or any other images or stories from the video or media and takes those particular ones to heart. In the 1950s, there was a television show based on the comic book character Superman. And anecdotally, periodically, there would be stories of very little kids who would end up going to the top of a garage with a bath towel on, claiming to be Superman, and jumping off of the bridge and hoping to fly, or the garage rather, hoping to fly. I don't know that if such stories existed today that you would be able more successfully to file a lawsuit and win, that the program ended up doing that. There is some reason to think that, especially with very young children, they can be influenced, but to see so clear an influence as to lead to a particular change in behavior might be more problematic, especially when you consider the other forms of socialization that are going on. I suppose if a child only had media images or depictions as the basis for social interaction, that might be a stronger argument. But I don't know that many people would allow their children to be raised in such a fashion as to be so susceptible to the influence of media. Even if you end up accepting some of the statistics that talk about the long number of hours that people supposedly spend watching television in the course of a day, it still raises the larger issue of whether or not it can be clear that media depictions have so strong an influence over individuals that they accept the messages conveyed in the media as valid and use them as guidance or follow them in their particular lives. So one of the problems, therefore, and this relates to a term we had talked about in an earlier chapter, Chapter 2, is of causation, being able to find that these factors had such a substantial influence, and being able to establish that these factors and these factors alone accounted for that kind of socialization. Still, another source of socialization could be adult socialization, which talks about, for example, the ways in which a person can be socialized as an adult. Think about it. most people who start off as parents don't have experience firsthand as being parents. How is it that they end up being able to learn what's needed to become a parent, especially where we may not have in a society parenting classes to do this? There may be ways, all sorts of sources of information that can guide the parent to being able to act as an appropriate guide for the development and care of a particular child. You could even have a situation where adults are socialized according to a particular environment. That is re-socialization, the way in which individuals' behavior adapts to a certain situation, so that the behaviors a person ended up using in, say, high school may not work as well or may need modification when it comes to socialization in a college environment. To that end, the last mentioned source of socialization would be so-called total institutions. And the idea of a total institution is that it is comprehensive, that it controls all aspects of a person's life. So typically when you think of a total institution, it would be something like the military or prison setting, where individuals are under the supervision of managers whose job it is to make sure that these individuals act in a particular way or follow particular kinds of rules. Not only do these total institutions need to have this level of control, but that there needs to be a measure of isolation, that an individual does not have connections, or at least the same kinds of connections that you would experience during daily life. On the one hand, it's true that when you think about it, there will be visitation hours for inmates in a prison, and yet the socialization process for people in prison is so comprehensive and it is reinforced so strongly that it's having a couple hours visits with family members is probably not going to be sufficient to rebut that. The socialization process of people getting used to life in prison actually has its own terms. According to Edwin Sullivan, this is the concept of prisonization. So some of the behaviors that are typical for that kind of total institution, such as standing for count, where periodically inmates are asked to get out of their particular cells and stand outside of those cells so that they can be counted. This happens throughout the day and generally occurs at least once, if not twice, during the night. After a while, these individuals end up becoming adapted to the process, and it becomes invisible to them because they've become so used to it. The difficulty for people who've been socialized in a total institution is what happens when they get out of it. And in fact, if you look at the experience of military personnel post-World War II, where many of them ended up joining the military in their late teens, they had difficulty adapting to an environment that had less structure. A similar phenomenon was witnessed in the late 1950s when the first types of medicines became available that allowed people with severe mental illness to be able to be returned to society, being taken out of the sort of small communities in which they had been kept, isolated and separate from larger communities, that these people had difficulty making an adjustment. And so it was no surprise when a similar difficulty was witnessed when it came to prisons, that people who go from prison to the unstructured environment outside of prison would have a difficult time. So in the context of criminal justice, this led to innovations broadly characterized as community-based corrections, which would be a transitional process by which individuals who had served, and I think the number is about 2 years in prison, which is a sufficient period of time for the behavior to become locked into the individual, to be able to learn again, reacquire the skills needed to be able to function outside of society. So it's not surprising to hear anecdotes of people who have done substantial sentences in prison to find that when they're out in the free world, that they might, if they go to a restaurant, forget to pay for their food because in prison they didn't have to. So there's plenty of evidence to indicate that in a total institution, with its complete rules and its isolation from external society, that people become re-socialized in a particular way. Look at some of the theories that talk about how socialization may end up happening. Robert Merton, who's a sociologist's name who you'll continue to hear about well beyond this class, talks about the role theory that individuals may have. So Merton speaks in terms of roles that reflect or relate to status. And in Merton's theory, status relates to a certain recognizable social position that an individual occupies. Having defined status, then Merton talks about roles. Roles are subordinate to status. That is, they carry with them certain kinds of duties and expectations from a particular kind of status. We'll find that on occasion, roles may not be reconcilable. The idea, therefore, of role strain is that there is a sense of incompatibility between particular roles associated with single status. What does that mean? Well, you might end up seeing the status of an individual such that the person has to play someone who is cold and unfeeling in society, perhaps a stereotypical role of what it means to be a man. But the difficulty that person ends up feeling then is being that cold, distant individual and then, for example, showing kindness or tenderness to a spouse or to offspring. That role strain would come from trying to reconcile those rather conflicting types of roles. It can even get to the point of producing role conflict when those particular demands are at loggerheads with one another, and so it becomes necessary for the person who's having problems with these roles to synthesize a new type of role or select one particular role over the others. In terms of status, the idea of a master status is one that overrides all other types of statuses, one that stands out. We can have a status set, which includes all the statuses that an individual would have. So a status set for somebody on a college campus would likely include being the child of parents as well as being of a student. So status set will include those different types of statuses. Status could be ascribed or involuntary, so that we could talk about one's age, for example, as being an ascribed status, something that people can't end up changing. Contrast ascribed with achieved status, which is voluntary or something that a person has assumed. It's probably pretty easy to distinguish between the two, since achieved status, by the word achieves, suggests that there is some form of action taken by the individual to accomplish this particular goal. If we have status and roles, look at a specialized set of roles known as gender roles. The idea of a gender role ends up meaning that an individual has adopted a series of behaviors or norms accompanying one's status as male or female. Understand, of course, that gender might be more complicated than the dichotomy of male or female. In fact, it can get pretty varied. But for purposes of our society, we tend to characterize individuals as one or the other. Of course, we're starting to see in our society a change that understands that gender may be malleable. So when we have transgendered individuals, we have individuals who alter their gender to better suit their sense of self-image. Perhaps one of the reasons why people might change gender roles, besides an innate feeling that the role that the person has adopted is inappropriate, is the type of power or significance that comes with a particular type of role. That in our society we expect different things of boys versus girls or men versus women. The cliches about being able to socialize children in a particular way we'll talk about, for example, in the nursery for a new child, whether it's blue or pink, or if parents are very sensitized to the idea that those kinds of colors convey certain messages to children about what to expect from their particular gender, a neutral kind of color, which wouldn't favor necessarily one or the other. When it comes down to something like gender roles, you may end up seeing that there are forms of external socialization that reinforce those. So we might see peer pressure that ends up causing a person to fall back on a particular role, that although the term may have changed in its use over time, nonetheless the idea of calling someone a fag or a faggot is meant disparagingly, somewhat hatefully. It is a way to suggest that the person's behavior is inconsistent with the selected gender, or at least the perceived gender. All of this idea of socialization prepares us for the idea of social construction of reality. Although this is a rather short place to stop, let me start here since this is a fairly big topic. And that's the end of part 2 of the chapter 4 video lecture.